Welcome. We're joined by political consultant Eric Hacopian. We'll be discussing what direction Armenia should take now in terms of foreign policy. Eric, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
So what direction in general should Armenia take now? You have mentioned the term democratic Eurasianism. Can you explain a bit about this?
Well, it's really not about what I think. I think what I'm going to speak of is the general attitude and the thinking among both, I would say, the decision-making intellectual classes and ordinary people. And I think Armenia, it's fair to say that the Armenian body politic is moving away from the West, but not against the West. And I want to be clear about that. What that means is that people want all the good things that the West offers, whether that's democracy, rule of law, but they see no future for themselves in the context of the Europe and the West. And I think if you're going to sort of try to coin what this ideology really is, I would call it like democratic Eurasianism, which is the thinking is that given to the extent that people feel abandoned or betrayed by the West, depending on the person's attitude, they see Armenia's future, north, south, and east, into closer relationships with Russia, openings to the south of us with Iran, essentially ignoring what the West has to say about what your limitations should be, and looking east, which is China and India, which practically it's going to become, it already is, the economic hub of the world. And I think clearly grounding yourself into the geography that you're in, which is, half Asia, half Europe, rather than looking in the European direction. The other thing which I think people miss is there's this myth out there that the Armenia's democratic transformation, I think this is where the democratic part of Eurasianism comes in, is Armenia's democratic transformation was not because it was demanded by the EU or mandated by any European powers. The Armenian democratic movement was very much deeply rooted in our culture, in our own traditions, because Armenians are very individualistic, and there's an element of this anarchist collective in Armenian culture, which is like everybody has their say. And it's quite anti-authoritarian, anti-totalitarian. Even during Soviet times, people here had more freedoms than in other places, because there's things that that Armenians will accept, and there's things that they won't. And for example, you can never have some kind of an Ataturk or Kim Jong-un cult of personality in Armenia. People would laugh you off if you try to make Vardan Petrosyan or any of these figures, into some kind of a cult figure. There's not even, you can drive around, this country has had 4 or 5 leaders. There's not a single statue of them anywhere. There's no airport named after them. So I think this democratic movement in Armenia has very little to do with the West. It has much more to do with our internal culture. But I think the whole attitude is that we need to understand what part of the world we're in and orient ourselves towards it. Looking at trade routes to the south, looking at political relations to the north of us, and having a better sense that we need to be grounded in our area, and specifically cultivating relationships that are sort of our enemies' enemies, and there's plenty of them around, and to sort of have far more stronger relationships with those countries.
And the way the West conducted itself throughout the war, what can Armenia learn from that?
Well, it's ALDM, Armenian lives don't matter. That's really what it comes down to. What we learned is that we are the only ones that are responsible for ourselves. We cannot rely on other people. And that's where we need to be focused on, that the West is not a reliable partner when the time comes. Now, again, having said this, it doesn't mean that people don't want trade engagement with the West or better relations with the West. But at the end of the day, I think people see an indifference towards us. But I think what's important here is that we should not respond to this indifference with anger. In fact, I think we should thank people for it, because what they did is they really told us where we stand. in the context of the world, which means that our lives have no value to anyone except ourselves. And most importantly, their indifference told us where we stand with them, which is that we're of marginal importance, and until we strengthen ourselves and are, in a very harsh manner, willing to look at the abyss that faces us and not blink, we will not be able to overcome our problems or impose our will on our problems and our opponents. So it's been a very harsh education, but I think we need to embrace it, we need to internalize it, and understand that they're indifferent towards us because they can be indifferent towards us. And the only people that can change that is us. And unless we become a more prosperous, more powerful country, we'll get more of the same.
And do you think the West is losing Armenia? Has the West already lost Armenia? And what can be done to change that?
Oh yeah, the short answer is yes. Just because of the previous things that I outlined. I think there's only one thing that I see in the short run that can change this. And it's entirely doable, and it's even possible. And that is strong Western involvement in a fair resolution of the Karabakh issue. And what is a fair resolution of the Karabakh issue from the Armenian side? It involves three things. It involves the physical safety of people who live in Artsakh. Number two, it involves any political scenario that does not involve Armenians living under Azeri rule of any kind. And third, some kind of a remedial secession, or if it's short of that, something that clearly establishes a difference and an independence on some level for Artsakh. And we have to be very careful with the language here. We're not interested in having status. As a friend of mine said, the Palestinians have status. That doesn't mean anything. You need concrete rights written into agreements that are enforceable. So if the West can bring a just resolution that involves these three factors, I think there's this move away from the West can be stopped. But short of that, I think people will conclude what I initially outlined, and this country is moving in another direction, which, by the way, some people will look at it and they go, well, who cares what direction Armenia goes in? First of all, the Armenia of today that people ignore is not the Armenia of 15, 20 years from now. Because times change, countries change, and the importance of countries change. And this part of the world, there's one primary decision to be made. Are you a pivot north-south, or are you a pivot east-west? And 5 or 10 years from now, if the Georgians understand that they're never going to be part of the EU and they're never going to be part of NATO, and there's an Armenia that has pivoted away from the West, there'll be a lot of pressure for them to do the same. And once that happens, this part of the world moves away from the West and moves towards the Eastern countries and the Eastern powers. Even though I think the Georgians will likely retain their democratic system because of many of the same reasons that we have. So you could have this unique part of the world that is in Europe, but not of it. So for people who say, what does it matter what Armenia does? It doesn't matter to the world what Armenia does now. But in 15, 20 years from now, it could be a completely different matter.
And where do you see Armenian foreign policy then moving over the next 10, 15 years? And furthermore, are there any places that Armenia could engage now that it didn't so much engage before, namely the Arab world, for example, Israel?
There's two variables here. One, if there's a just resolution of the Karabakh issue over the next 6 months to a year that provides the three parameters that I outlined, which is going to be difficult to do, but frankly, if the world powers want to make it happen, they can make it happen. It's been done before. If Russia and the West are on the same page and they get into a room in Aliyev and they force him to sign something he doesn't like to sign. They have the leverage to do that. It's a question of do they use that leverage. Because if the West is, is willing to put some muscle behind their actions, and the Russians want this settled for their own purposes in their own way, it's not inconceivable. And the countries in this region are minnows in the context of the world. So you can only contradict the world so much. So I think if that happens, I think Armenia and this region, frankly, can develop in a very functional way. These countries will eventually, find a way to live with each other. At the end of the day, these countries have to find a way to live with each other because no one's going anywhere. Everyone is in this neighborhood, and you can like people, you can hate people. People have done atrocious things to each other, but at the end of the day, time passes, and there has to be peace between all of these countries. That's the ultimate goal. That should be everyone's ultimate goal, no matter how horrific today's situation is. But I can tell you, if this issue gets left unresolved, and Armenia moves in that, what I call that Eurasian direction, which I think we can do successfully over a period of time. This will be a very belligerent country, especially once it's reorganizes its military and it becomes stronger, and as time passes and Azerbaijan becomes poorer just because of the less relevance of carbon energy in the world. You either fix the situation now, or you're going to be dealing with a more functional country that is probably wealthier, more developed, and can make Israel look like Sweden in its attitude towards its neighbors. Because regardless of all of our problems right now, the things that Azerbaijan needs to fix over the next 15 or 20 years are far more substantial than what Armenia needs to fix. Because they need to do something that no country has ever been able to do successfully, which is to move from essentially making money by doing nothing, which is all resource-based economies, to an economy that needs to pay for itself. And the outcomes are far more Venezuela than they are Austria. So this is the time to solve these issues. And if the world does not solve these issues, and I can tell you these issues will not be solved by the people here regionally. There's just too much animus here. This needs to be forced upon us. And in this case, on the Azeris, because they are the ones holding the cards. And if it's not done, you could have very nasty outcomes over the next 15 or 20 years.
Well, Eric, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.